Hey guys, welcome to Planet Zoo. Today I'm talking about terrain because, if I'm honest, terraforming used to be something that I wasn't great at. It's only really in the last 6 months or so that I've got better using the terrain tools. So I wanted to share with you some of the little tricks and tips that have helped me incorporate better landscaping into my games. So tip number 1, figure out the terrain first. If you're going to incorporate different heights and different types of terrain, make sure you're marking that down first before you get started with any of the pathing, any of the buildings going down. Believe me, it's much easier to plan out the terrain first. Whenever I'm starting a new zoo, I do tend to have an idea in my head of what the landscape's going to look like. What I'll do is I'll go and take a look at stuff on Google Maps and Google Earth to see what it actually looks like and figure out from there how I can incorporate that into my zoo. Once you've got a good idea of what you think the landscape's going to look like, that's when you can go into the game and just mark this all out with the terrain paint first. So if you go into the terrain tab down here and go down to the bit that says painting, then just pick out one of the colours that's really light, apart from snow, because snow will disappear once you have the game running. So I usually go for one of the sands, like the fine sand. And then you just mark out on the map where things are going to sit. So you can plan space accordingly and have high points, have low points, mark out some rivers and stuff. And it just works out better to plan this out before you start putting stuff into the zoo so it's more balanced. So yeah, that's tip number 1 to do with the planning. Next, I'm going to go on to terrain stamps. Terrain stamps are a great way to fill in the landscape. Up on the top of the terrain tab, we have the sculpting tab. And what you could do in here, so we have the first one here is the pull, and if we go onto the land here and use that, you can see it brings up the landscape. But even though that's sat at the biggest size and it's at the biggest intensity, that takes forever. If I was to do that across the entire map, that's going to be at least 4 or 5 hours worth of work, at least 4 or 5 hours to fill in a whole map using that terrain tool. So a better option for this, if you go down to the second tab down here, that's the terrain stamp tool. So if we just start adding in some of the terrain fill here, this is much quicker to fill in the gap than it is to use the sculpting tools alone. Now, I know this is looking very blocky at the moment, and that's fine, because this is kind of like the base layer at the moment. So it doesn't need to be all filled in and look natural. All we're trying to do with this is get a rough layout of what the mountain shape will look like. And what I didn't mention here, what you can do as well, whilst you're putting in these little bits of terrain, if you hold down the shift key, this will move the terrain stamp up and down, which makes it a little easier to get the right heights in here. Now, the next stage to this, what we need to do is go back up to the sculpting tool, and you want to click on the pull tool, and then this will just fill in. If you run over the square blocks, it'll start filling it in and looks a lot more natural like this. But using the terrain stamp first, that saved a lot of time. Something else to think of while you're doing this bit is one of the shortcut tools. If you press the control button while you've got this pull tool on, that does the reverse, so it will push the terrain instead of pulling it. And if you play around with that, so sometimes pushing, sometimes pulling it, it's a bit quicker than going and doing it manually on the terrain tab, switching between the two. Something a little more advanced I use the terrain stamp for is to make natural looking beaches. The usual way to make a bed of water would be to, you're probably familiar with this way, is to push into the ground with the push button, then go to flatten foundation, and it'll make a little dip in the ground like that, which when we go to the water tool and if we fill that in, there you go, makes a body of water. But the water's edge here is looking rather ugly at the moment like this. That's just far too rough. So let me take that water out. Now what I could do is if I used the smooth tool here and make that nice and smooth around the side. Let's go. Let's fill that back in with the water. And yeah, you can see there, it's smoothed out a little bit. So that this is where we've smoothed it out. And if you look at the section here, this is still rough, looking a bit Minecrafty blocky at the side there, which we don't want. But even on this side, this to me is still, it's not natural. It goes very steep into the water there. And when I want to make a natural looking beach, let me get rid of this water again. What I do is I use the terrain stamp tool. So pick up the terrain stamp, and then if you press X, this gives you the fine movement on here. So if I press that again, it brings up this little tool here. And what I want to do is just sort of dip it slightly like this and then bring it down. And if I put that in there, that offers a much smoother transition into the water. My next tip is about making space for your enclosures and things at different heights. So I've loaded up one of the pre-generated height maps that we got with the 1.7 update of the game. And what I want to show here is using these levels to your advantage. So this little corner here, I'm going to use the flatten terrain tool on this little bit here and just flatten that all out at the bottom here. And just do the same up here, use the flatten terrain tool to smooth all this out. And it kind of makes it look like a little step, which doesn't look very natural right now. But if you put in an enclosure on the bottom section here, and then you put in an enclosure on the top section, it kind of blends into the landscape really well. And I use this a lot now in my zoos. So I'll jump cut to what I've built recently that shows how this works. So this is what I mean about using the landscape at different levels like this. So you've got an enclosure below, then you can have a little path there that guests can see either enclosure from, and you've got the little enclosure at the top there as well. And once you've got the different decorations, like putting some rocks and trees and foliage in there, it looks a lot more natural and it gives an excellent view into both enclosures. So that's my tip 3. Use the flatten terrain tool to flatten out the terrain on different levels like this, so your enclosures seem to step up into the mountains. Tip number 4. Tip number 4 is about the dreaded pathing system, because you can't talk about terrain and not talk about the pathing system at all. Oh, and apologies guys, if you can hear something weird in the background here, it is absolutely raining cats and dogs outside. I've got hail, probably snow. The weather is just absolutely miserable outside in real life, so hopefully it's not bleeding through too badly on the recording. Anyway, let's get on with tip number 4. So, pathing in Planet Zoo, very much like the water in Planet Zoo, it has a lot of coding around it. So, it's not just on the path itself, it's about the terrain either side of the path. So, if you are messing with the terrain a lot, you might get a lot of errors cropping up saying that, oh, path can't be placed because the terrain's too uneven, stuff like that. So the way you get around that is to treat the path as if it's got a barrier either side, and you need to make sure that the terrain is as smooth as it possibly can be either side of the path itself. Now, this is relatively easy if you're working with a flat zoo. If you're working with a zoo with a lot of terrain modification, it can be a bit more complicated. There's 2 ways I work with this. The first being the easier one, which is to elevate the path away from the terrain, so physically take it off the ground, and yeah, you're going to be left with this ugly gap underneath, but you can hide that with rocks. So for example, in the North Africa zoo that I built here, I've got these nice stairs that are symmetrical on either side, and that's all built above the ground. It's away from the terrain itself. And I've just hidden that with all the rocks that are around the side here. Now, the other way to work with elevators, terrain, and the pathing is to use the terrain stamp again. So wherever you want to take your path, whatever elevation you want it to go up, if you get the terrain stamp and angle that at a nice low incline, you can follow that right through to ground level. And the way the tool works here, you can even twist and turn that, and it will still keep level. So if we put that in, it looks a bit ugly, but what you do here would be to use the smoothing tool, then use the raised terrain and lower terrain around it. So let me just show you how it looks on one that I've already prepared. So this giant penguin enclosure, the way the path twists and turns up the mountain here, that's the technique I used, using the terrain stamp to work your way up the side of the mountain whilst keeping that path nice and smooth. Okay, so tip number 5 is a very quick one. I just wanted to mention something about scale. Sometimes where I've had problems before with the terrain modification is going too big. Ideally, what you want is for your zoo to blend in with the landscape that surrounds it. So whatever biome you've chosen, You want it to blend in nicely with that landscape, and that means being super careful about not making the mountains too big or the lakes too deep. For me, the ideal height for a step change in the elevation is about the size of a standard wall piece, so about 4 meters. A good example of this is the Christmas zoo that I did here. So I've got the stairs going up the center here, so the elevation actually dips down at the start and then it gets higher as you get to the back of the zoo here. And this is all about 4 meters in height, so every time we go to a new level, it's about 4 meters. And that to me is a more natural looking elevation. Any higher than that and it might start looking a bit abnormal. Right, I did say that would be a quick one. So on to my next tip, which is about terrain mapping. Now, terrain mapping hasn't been around very long. It was a brand new thing that's been brought into Planet Zoo from the 1.7 update. So from the main menu, when you go to create a new zoo in the sandbox mode, you've now got this new option that you can select, and this will alter the terrain automatically. There's some options here that are pre-generated by Planet Zoo already, but, and now here's the fun thing, you can actually make your own. Unfortunately, that's not the easiest thing to do. What you have to do is have a grayscale image of a landscape, and the lighter the colours goes, the higher that will pre-generate in the map. So if you were making your own one of those on like Photoshop or Paint or something, you're going to get a pretty gnarly looking landscape with lots of harsh borders. Not exactly what you want for this. However, the internet has come up with a solution. You see, this feature of creating a custom map for a game already exists for City Skylines. So you can essentially use the height map program that's available free online that has been generated for City Skylines and use this for generating the height maps in Planet Zoo. Although it does need a few tweaks to work in Planet Zoo, which I'll run through now. So if you go to Google and search for City Skylines map generator, this little one will come up here. So if we go into here, and what this does is it just gives you a map of the entire world. So basically you just click anywhere in the world and it'll plonk this grid down, which is what will be used for auto-generating a height map. The only little problem with this really is that this is obviously built for the City Skylines game, and with City Skylines you'd be playing this map at a much higher level, whereas with Planet Zoo you'd want to be zoomed in a bit further. So you've got to use your imagination a little here. Pick an area of map where there is some terrain modification going on, there is a little bit of height going on, but I would also say be careful not to go too high, because if the peaks are too drastic, it doesn't look realistic when you load it into the game. So pick somewhere where there's a little bit of height going on, but it's kind of a smooth hill more than a massive mountain. Anyway, there's an area here, looks okay, so all I need to do now is click on this little button here that will download this into a PNG height map for me. And if we open that up, you can see it's given me this nice little map here of the height map in grayscale. Now, what you're supposed to do with these maps is you need to change them into a TIFF file and then save it in the Frontier folder, which is saved on your hard drive under the height map. The only problem with that is, as it stands now, the coloration on this map is way too dark. Because we're working with the grayscale code, the flatness of the map on the basic map in Planet Zoo, to get to ground level flat, you need that to be grayscale 128 on the RGB scale. So I need to tweak this map first in Photoshop to get the colours lightened up a little bit so it's not going to be sunk right into the ground when I load it into the game. So I've preloaded this into Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, I'm sure there's probably the same functionality on programs like GIMP that you can do this on. I don't know how to use those, so that's why I'm sticking with Photoshop. And it's a really simple process now to get this ready for in-game. Basically, all I need to do is make sure that this is 1024 pixels both ways. So going to image and image size, making sure that says 1024 by 1024. Now, I need to make sure that the base part of the image is the same RGB color as the map needs to be in Planet Zoo, which was 128. So I'm going to create another layer here, and using the paintbrush tool and making sure the color is 128 by 128 by 128 on the RGB here. Okay, so that's fine. What I need to do is zoom into the map and then just do a tiny dab down here. And you can see quite clearly the color difference is quite drastic there. What we need is for that very dark color to match up with that very light color that we've just done there. And there's an easy way to do that. What I'm going to do is change this coloration to pure white and then go up to the rectangle box here and create a rectangle that covers the entire image. Now, I need to zoom in a little bit here so I can see a bit clearer. And what I'm going to do is change the opacity of this rectangle so that it matches up with that little dot we did before. So if we change this opacity down to about half, now you can see that little dot quite well there. And that means that the darker background behind that's going to be lower than the ground level when this gets imported into game. So we just need to tweak this a little bit until those colors are almost exactly the same. It's normally around the 50 to 53% opacity that it kind of melds into the same color, but it varies map to map, so just be careful with that as well. And I'm happy with that, so all I need to do now is change this into a TIFF file, save it in that right folder, and we'll go back into game and load this up and see what it looks like. And this is the result. So it's not perfect. The edging is a little off. You would just have to keep going back into the image and tweaking that opacity to get this to line up exactly or near to exactly as you could. But I think you get the idea. This is a great way to create realistic custom maps from real life examples of terrain. Anyway, that's my top tips for working with terrain. I hope it's been helpful. Let me know in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.